Alright, so in this video, I'm going to talk to you about Between the World and Me. And I know you read an excerpt, it's really similar. It's essentially the first chapter, the first part of the actual book, an early version of it. And so I'll talk a little bit about a few pieces that are in the book itself, but for the most part, we'll be talking about what you've read today. As you read it, I am sure you noticed that, there is so much in what Coates talks about that relates to our conversations on what the streets are as an entity, how they shape Black life, and what do people do in response to that, right? So we'll talk and dig into that, and I'm hoping that you also noticed similarities or, kind of through lines between what we read here, this week with Coates, with Ta-Nehisi Coates' work, what you saw in Ann Petrie, and what you saw in the poetry you looked at. So this week is wrapping up our discussion of literature, but I'm hoping you're seeing some connections here. So, I want to start by talking to you about the nature of this book, or the narrative style in and of itself. And I mentioned in the introductory video that Coates writes this. It's creative nonfiction, so it's kind of like a memoir, but not really, right? Because this isn't him reflecting entirely on his life. It's not a novel, right? These aren't fictional characters and things like that. But he is creative, and there's a poetic voice and interesting imagery in there, and the idea of the streets and the dream and things like that. So it's creative nonfiction. And so I'll talk about Coates as the narrator because he takes up a unique voice, right? So it's just the same, and I mentioned this in the introductory video, as if something crazy happens to me at the store and I go home and I'm going to tell my friends and my family about it, I'm gonna, I want to make the story exciting and engaging, so I'm going to embellish a little bit, or I'm going to add flares and details, and I'm taking on a different role as a storyteller, right? So that's what happens in things like this creative nonfiction, is that Coates, as the narrator, is thinking through things and explaining them in a different way than maybe the actual human being does, right? So as a narrator, he is speaking to his son, right? So the entire book is framed as a letter to his son. And this is in response to a couple of things, right? So on one hand, and he mentions this in the piece that you read, his son, after Trayvon Martin's murderer is not convicted of any crimes, his son, breaks down crying in his room because that's his kind of moment of realization of how unjust the world can be towards Black people, and particularly young Black boys like him, right? And so that's kind of his moment of reckoning or realizing that. And Coates, wants to speak to his son about that, and in some ways comfort him, but for him, comfort is really kind of taking the veil off of society to show it for what it really is, and then encouraging his son to navigate the realities of the world in particular ways. And that's really what this book is about. He also writes this because seeing his son mourn reminds him of a story of his own childhood, right? So he goes back and talks a lot about growing up in West Baltimore and what it was like, to be in the hood, and the threats that he faced, and the ways that his parents and family members and friends reacted to those realities. And what that felt like for him, right? As someone who was aware of his Blackness and the way that the world perceived him, but was also, like any other kid, trying to navigate, his nerdiness, his, love for writing, his this and that, right? And how those things aren't opposites. I think often we have, particularly in film and television, these narratives that want to place it like, kids like Coates who love writing or are smart but struggle in school, it's because they don't really belong in the hood, because we've racialized urban Black space as somehow antithetical to creativity, to community, to goodness, right? But Coates really frames that he did very much belong to West Baltimore, right? That was his childhood, that was his place. And his gifts and his intellect and his struggles aren't something separate. They don't make him an exception, someone who should be plucked out of that space, right? He very much tells a story of he is a part of West Baltimore, right? But that the people live there react and respond different ways, just like every other human being. And I think that's something beautiful that he does in this book. But he tells those stories of his childhood. I'm going to play you this short clip because it helps set up the role that West Baltimore plays as both landscape and kind of the central part of how he frames his story and his understanding of the world. I'm also going to play it because Coates has a wonderful narrative voice, much better than mine, and most authors aren't great at at narrating their own works, and his is good. This is a very short clip that was used to promote the book, but it gives you a good sense of the role that space plays in the book. And so I want you to pay attention, both listen to the story, right? And this is part of what you read, but hear him tell it, again, from this personal experiential lens. And also look at the images, right? Because this clip, just like the rest of the book, is weaving together kind of personal identity and experience and Black space.
The boy with the small eyes reached into his ski jacket and pulled out a gun. I recall it in the slowest of motions, as though in a dream. There the boy stood with the gun brandished, which he slowly untucked, tucked, and then untucked once more. And in his small eyes, I saw a surging rage that could, in an instant, erase my body. That was 1986. That year I felt myself to be drowning in the news reports of murder. I was aware that these murders very often did not land upon the intended targets, but fell upon great aunts, PTA mothers, overtime uncles, and joyful children. Fell upon them random and relentless, like great sheets of rain. I knew this in theory, but could not understand it as fact until the boy with the small eyes stood across from me, holding my entire body in his small hands. The boy did not shoot. His friends pulled him back. He did not need to shoot. He had affirmed my place in the order of things. He had let it be known how easily I could be selected. I took the subway home that day, processing the episode all alone. I did not tell my parents. I did not tell my teachers. And if I told my friends, I would have done so with all the excitement needed to obscure the fear that came over me in that moment. I remember being amazed that death could so easily rise up from the nothing of a boyish afternoon, billow up like fog. I knew that West Baltimore, where I lived, that the north side of Philadelphia, where my cousins lived, that the south side of Chicago, where the friends of my father lived, comprised a world apart. Somewhere out there beyond the firmament, past the asteroid belt, there were other worlds where children did not regularly fear for their bodies.
So we'll come back to the way he frames, like he uses beautiful imagery of galaxies and worlds to really define and talk about racialized space, which we'll get to in a couple of slides. But you'll notice here, you know, his narrative of just like a childhood day, right? But then confronted with the reality of a gun and what that can do to you and that potential violence. And the way he frames it is not in terms of, you know, the kind of conservative narratives we've talked about of like, well, black on black violence is the real issue, which erases the reality of how the streets and the violence that are among them are the direct product of government and public policy created to confine Black people, to limit their opportunities, and to increase their sense of fear, right? What he does is he tells this narrative in such a personal experiential lens to really focus on what is the experience of having your life, or as he frames it, your body threatened, and understanding your place in the world, right? I don't know if I get to this on another side, so I'll just frame this here. You'll notice he uses a lot of language where he talks about, you know, the body, or, you know, the black body, and different people have different ideas on that. Some people don't love that language, some people do. What I will say is Coates, and he talks about this in the book, frames this as a philosophy of the disembodied. He talks about that, and really what he's trying to do is, particularly from his worldview as someone who sees this life is it, and he talks, the excerpt you read about how he didn't grow up religious. He firmly believes that this life is it. So for him, that frames violence against black people in a very particular light, right? If your body is really all you are, if you're not a soul, if you're not a spirit, if you are just the physical body, what does it mean for that to be under threat, right? The stakes are, for him, much higher, right? And then he talks about what it's like to grow up feeling like that body, your life, is persistently under threat, whether it's from the police or whether it's from people who have internalized that white supremacist violence and then carry guns and do other things in the streets. Either way, he's talking about what that does to someone, and he talks about that as the philosophy of the disembodied. And this might remind you a little bit of the poems we read, right? And those conversations that the poets were having through their work of what happens when you internalize those social conditions and realities around you. But just like the poems, which a lot of you really dug into the way they express the emotional experience of that, Coates really narrates, again, like, how does this form you as a human being when you are growing up in this? And he uses his own narratives and experiences of growing up as a way to then speak to his son and hopefully influence his formation as a young black person in this world. The last kind of story that really frames this, and you don't get this in the excerpt you read, but it's a fundamental part of the book, and if you haven't read it, it's very worth it. It's a short book. It's really short, but it's a really good read, and so I'd encourage you to check it out. But he tells the story of Prince Jones, and so Prince, who you hear him mention and talk about Howard and how important Howard University was and kind of his, coming of age. Prince is someone he knows from Howard, becomes a good friend of his, but unlike, Coates in the book, Prince Jones comes from Prince George County, who, he comes from kind of a upper middle class black family, very Christian, in the eyes of kind of dominant U.S. society. Prince's family fits all of the kind of respectability politics requirements, right? Like, I think his mother was a doctor. He goes and does after school activities. He goes to church. He goes to Howard University. Prince fits everything that society says black people need to do to be respectable, right? But on his way home, Prince is stopped by a police officer and he ends up being murdered, right? And so what happens to Prince really becomes a formative experience for Coates, because he sees the fact that it doesn't matter, if you are the most quote-unquote respectable black person or if you're someone from the hood of West Baltimore, your blackness, your body marks you as, as vulnerable to violence in this world and in this country. And so he's trying to teach his son some of these lessons so that his son can live a little bit more free, right? Because to Coates, you're not free if you're just trying to find ways to prove your worth and your value as a human being, rather than just knowing your value and struggling against the systems and the conditions that try to tell you different. So those are the stories that really inform the book. So another thing I wanted to point out to you, and this is partially this is in what you read, but I have the page numbers from the actual book. But this is similar to what we read in Petrie, right? You see a use of nature imagery as a way to describe the social forces of the streets, right? And in this case, he's talking about race. But I'll read these quotes, and I want you to think back to Petrie. Think about the ways in which these writers are using something that should be legible or understandable to all readers, and particularly readers who don't have that experience of being Black in this world, or maybe young readers or people who haven't thought about their Blackness in these ways, right? We all understand the nature of natural disasters, and he uses that understanding to describe and define social forces. So I'll read you these two quotes. The first one says, Americans believe in the reality of race as a defined, indubitable feature of the natural world. In this way, racism is rendered as the innocent daughter of Mother Nature, and one is left to deplore the Middle Passage, or the Trail of Tears, the way one deplores an earthquake, a tornado, or any other phenomenon that can be cast as beyond the handiwork of men. I'm going to read you the other quote and then I'll explain what's going on here. And then the second one, and this is where he's talking about his friend Prince's murder. He says, I could see no difference between the officer who killed Prince Jones and the police who died or the firefighters who died. They were not human to me. Black, white, or whatever, they were the menaces of nature. They were the fire, the comet, the storm, which could with no justification shatter my body. So there's an interesting balance here, right? On one hand, he kind of condemns or cautions readers against, seeing kind of racism or white supremacy as just a fact of the world and like nothing you can do about them, right? Because when we use natural disasters, we think, well, that's just the way it is. We can't prevent tornadoes. We can't prevent earthquakes, right? And so he cautions against that in that first part, right? That we can't just chalk up racism as a fact and say, well, that's just the way the world is, right? But on the other hand, he does use that imagery to really express the significance and the force behind racism, right? So when he talks about his friend who was murdered, due to police violence, he points out it's not about that individual officer, right? It's about the larger force that socializes people in power, particularly people in policing power, to see Black people as not human and to equip them with the means to take their life, right? And so he does a fine balance, and I think really is taking up the mantle from someone like Petrie in the way she used natural imagery, but also making sure that's not an excuse to just, no longer resist it. Because if we see racism or, the history of what's happened with housing segregation, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of it, right? And if we see it as just like, it's too late, it's just the way the world is, it's easy to just not want to do anything about it, right? Or just to say, well, all I can do is my piece to live my life the best way possible. And Coates very much rails against that belief, right? Like Petrie, he critiques this idea that, individuals alone can solve or make their way or escape these realities, right? He really emphasizes the need for communal action, and we'll circle back to that. But I wanted to point this out to you because it's an interesting kind of continuation of what we saw in Petrie. So another piece of this personal, and this is where I say familial narrative, and you'll read a little bit about this in the kind of criticism or the chapter from How the Streets Are Made that you're looking at. He talks a lot about the implications of growing up in Black spaces where there are these limitations and these very physical threats to Black life, such as police violence. He really digs into what does that do not only to a person, but to families and to cycles and to generations. And I know there were a couple of you who talked about this in your post last week, and I told you we'd circle back to that, and this is exactly what we're going to look at. So as he's writing, the narrator's writing this letter and talking to his son, he, he admits that he's afraid for his son's life, right? He's afraid of what that means for his son. And whether you're a parent or not, you can at least empathize with and imagine, pouring all the love and attention and hopes and dreams that you have into this person and not knowing whether or not they can actually live and fulfill those desires because of this looming threat of white supremacist violence, right? That's part of what he talks about with Prince Jones. And I don't think I put that quote in here. I wish I had. But there's a part in the excerpt where you read, where he talks about, when someone's murdered, think about all of the soccer games and the after school programs and all the time poured into that life, right? It's not just that that person's body was broken or killed, but it's all of that love, all of that time poured into them. It actually reminds me of a line in a Kendrick Lamar song. If you're familiar with XXX, where he talks about, there's that line, I can't remember it offhand exactly, but he's like, think of all the moments and the love that you can never get back, right? And that's what we don't often have a conversation about. So that's the thing that he fears, right? What does this mean for his son's life? He's brought this human being into the world, but he's afraid. And that fear leads him to really talk about, well, what is the implication of fearing anti-Black violence? How does that impact Black families, right? So I'm going to read you this quote where he says, "I'm still afraid, and I feel the fear most acutely whenever you leave me. But I was afraid long before you, and in this I was unoriginal. My father was so very afraid. I felt it in the sting of his black leather belt, which he applied with more anxiety than anger. My father who beat me as if someone might steal me away, because that is exactly what was happening all around us. Everyone lost a child, somehow, to the streets, to jail, to drugs, to guns. It was said that these lost girls were sweet as honey, it would not hurt a fly. It was said that these lost boys had just received a GED and had begun to turn their lives around. And now they were gone, and their legacy was a great fear." So, I mean, this fear is not, again, it's not, hypothetical. It's not potential. It's something, as he's saying in the last part, that people experience every single day, whether it's, it's real and it's tangible, right? I think of something that was in the news just a few weeks ago here in Minneapolis is a mom, a young Black mom who was on the phone with her 18-year-old son who was in a store shopping, getting some stuff, and there was a shooting, and she heard her son, die on the phone, right? And he just turned 18, and like this says at the end, he was, had worked hard and made it through, persevered through, well, persevere is not the right word, but he had experienced homelessness and had found a way to finish his education and was kind of getting his life off the ground and doing better, and then, loses his life in that way. And so that reality, that real potential to lose your child in that way, whether it's to jail, to drugs, to guns, as he says, impacts Black families. And so he really opens up to a conversation that isn't had publicly very often, to say, well, what does that look like, right? And he explains how it translates into discipline, and often kind of over discipline, right? So he talks about his father, spanking him with the belt, right? And it being more anxiety than anger. And I put the other quote from the reading where he says, this wasn't his dad saying it, but kind of a refrain you often hear from Black parents, either I can beat him or the police, right? So this idea of using, whether it's violence or other means of fear to get your kids to behave in a way that somehow might protect them from these external threats of violence. So in many ways, it's like the exchange of external violence for internal violence for a very different motive, from a very different type of violence, right? Like not the same at all, to be clear. But he really digs into, like, what does it mean that relationships between parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and children are so shaped by fear that it's about instilling in them a sense of, behaving in a certain way and being fearful of the realities around them simply because they want to preserve their lives, right? So it comes out of a place of anxiety and love. But what does that do when that becomes the center of those familial relationships, those generational relationships? Is a lot of trauma and a lot of broken relationships because of that, right? And so it's something that I think it's a unique aspect of the streets that Coates digs into through these very personal narratives. It's something he attempts to change in writing this book to his son as a way to, you know, to kind of reveal the reality of the world and maybe in that way help him understand it. Not necessarily be afraid of it, but understand it enough so that he can maybe be protected. And then he just accepts that he is afraid and he's going to be afraid for his son's life. But that's just the nature of how things are, right? He can struggle against that, but he also can't deny that reality. So that's another kind of unique, interesting aspect of the reading that you did. I want to talk a little bit more about the way Coates describes and talks about the streets. It's pretty obvious. It's kind of throughout the entire thing you read. He really digs into the streets, right? We just got done reading that passage about people losing their children or their loved one to the streets. And he really digs into this idea of the streets and the dream, right? And again, this should make you think of Petrie, right? She talks a lot. Ludi is obsessed with getting her American dream, but over the course of the novel, she comes to realize the threat of the streets is real and it's too much for her as an individual to overcome, right? And so Coates does a similar thing where he talks about the streets, and because he grew up in them, he really gives us a narrative understanding of why people from the outside who perceive black space in one way, what is the reality of it from those living in those spaces, right? So I'm going to read you this first quote. He says, "To be black in Baltimore, in the Baltimore of my youth," and that's important, in the Baltimore of his youth is giving a very specific time and place to the black space he's talking about, right? Was to be naked before the elements of the world, before all the guns, fists, knives, crack, rape, and disease. The law did not protect us. And now, in your time, he's talking to his son, the law has become an excuse for stopping and frisking you, which is to say, for furthering the assault on your body. But a society that protects some people through a safety net of schools and government-backed loans and ancestral wealth, but can protect you only with the club of criminal justice, has either failed at enforcing its good intentions or succeeded at something much darker. This passage is really at the heart of this class, right? You'll notice he is alluding to, and if we hadn't studied some of the things we did in the first couple weeks, you might miss this. He is talking about the history of geographic segregation. He is talking about the fact that spaces like West Baltimore, where people from the outside just see guns, fists, knives, crack, rape, are the direct engineered product of public and government policy, right? That this was by design, as he frames it, something much darker, right? That this is a dark design to create segregated white and black spaces. And now all we see is one type of kind of behaviors and characteristics associated not only with black space, but with blackness itself. And then that becomes the excuse, as he talks about, to assault the people who live there or the people who look like that. So on one hand, these spaces have been created through public policy. We talked about that. And you take out resources and you put in police and, you put people in conditions where, drug use and, other types of violence are going to thrive. And then you make that an excuse to then take those negative characterizations and cast them on the entirety of blackness. That becomes an excuse then to frisk and police and to kill black people altogether. And so he's tying together in very interesting ways what happens in policy to what happens to people, right? And to what happens to his son, who has never lived in that kind of an environment. His son is not from that West Baltimore, right? But still his son has to live very much, not just figuratively, but literally through his skin, the legacy of those policies, because his blackness makes him a target for, policing and violence. So it's really interesting how he sees the streets as not just that physical space of like urban Black neighborhoods, but as this larger identity or construct that really shapes the way all Black people are perceived, regardless of where they live, what they've done. Even Prince, right, his friend who's murdered, who is from this well-to-do family in this wealthy Black county, his Blackness ties him to the streets or to these understandings of Blackness as urban, poor, ghetto, etc., and justifies in the eyes of white supremacy his murder. And so Coates talks about the streets as both kind of, this physical and cultural space that defines life and makes people behave in certain ways, which I'll get to in another side, but also as this larger entity that shapes the way Black people and Blackness are understood altogether in this nation. So this is part that you heard in the clip, and I'll read it one more time because it's where you get the title of the book, Between the World and Me, and it, again, these couple slides really get at the heart of what we're doing in this course. So this is where he says, I knew that West Baltimore, where I lived, that the north side of Philadelphia, where my cousins lived, that the south side of Chicago, where friends of my father lived, comprised a world apart. Somewhere out there, beyond the firmament, past the asteroid belt, there were other worlds where children did not regularly fear for their bodies. I knew this because there was a large television in my living room. In the evenings I would sit before this television bearing witness to the dispatches from this other world. There were little white boys with complete collections of football cards. Their only want was a popular girlfriend, and their only worry was poison oak. That other world was suburban and endless, organized around pot roast, blueberry pies, fireworks, ice cream sundaes, immaculate bathrooms, and small toy trucks that were loosed in wooded backyards with streams and endless lawns. So this quote, which is it's extended from what you heard, really fleshes out not just the nature of Black and white space in terms of geographic segregation, right? Because these West Baltimore, Philly, Southside Chicago, these are Black urban spaces, right? And then he contrasts that with kind of white suburbia. But he ties that to not just these physical spaces, but all of what that means, right? In terms of culture, in terms of lifestyle, perception, opportunity. In one space, in this Black space, right, which he says, might as well be a world apart. When he uses the language of galaxies and asteroid belts, he's explaining how in the very same country, in this very same nation, you can have people living in completely different worlds and realities, right? And in one reality, you are living in, with threats of violence against your body. You are living in fear. You are living with limited opportunities. And this is what forms you as a young kid, right? And we don't think about what does that mean when that forms your, coming of age in this world. And in this other, what he describes as, what might as well be across the galaxy world of white suburbia, you have more of a carefree life and what we tend to define dominantly as everyday American life of relationships and, pot roasts and PTA meetings and things like that. Not to say by any stretch that realities in both those spaces are not more complicated than that, right? There are pot roasts and community get-togethers and PTA meetings in the hood, and there are, drug use and issues in the suburbs, right? To be clear. But what he's explaining is systematically how these spaces were created, how they're perceived, and how the people in those spaces are allowed to grow and live under those beliefs and perceptions. That creates radically different perceptions of yourself and your future, right? And that's what he's getting at. And he really describes, I think, that language of Between the World and Me, which is the title, and, between kind of his experience and that other world. It just shows how vast the divide is ideologically, culturally, experientially. And we don't often think about that, right? When you look on a map and you see these spaces side by side, you don't think about what that means, might as well mean, in terms of opportunity, in terms of one's kind of self-formation. So, this is still talking about the streets in the dream, but there's one. This is circling back to that conversation of families, but this is slightly different because it's talking about, youth in particular, um, and the impact of what is it like to constantly live, in this state of fear and terror when you know that because of the design of your neighborhood, because of the threat of police violence, because of poverty and lack of opportunity, what does it mean when you're living in kind of constant fear and terror, right? And again, he redefines our understanding of terror in a lot of ways. So I'm going to read you his kind of explanation of what this does, connecting to what we talked about in the last slide. What this does is to youth growing up in these circumstances. When I was your age, the only people I knew were black, and all of them were powerfully, adamantly, dangerously afraid. It was always right in front of me. The fear was there in the extravagant boys of my West Baltimore neighborhood, in their large rings and medallions, their big puffy coats and full-length fur-collared leathers, which was their armor against their world. They would stand on the corner of Gwyn Oak and Liberty, or Cold Spring and Park Heights, or outside, I don't know how to say that, some mall, and their hands dipped in Russell sweats. I think back on those boys now, and all I see is fear. And all I see is them girding themselves against the ghost of the bad old days when the Mississippi mob gathered round their grandfathers so that the branches of the black body might be torched and then cut away. The fear lived on in their practice bop, their slouching denim, their big t-shirts, the calculated angle of their baseball caps, a catalog of behaviors and garments enlisted to inspire the belief that these boys were in firm possession of everything they desired. So this this is explored more in depth in the second reading assigned for this week, but I just want to briefly kind of make note of something unique that Coates does, which is talk about, really deconstruct the external perception of Black youth by reframing the reality of fear, right, and violence against Black people. So if you think back a couple weeks when we talked about public discourse and we talked about Reaganism and the war on drugs, and particularly the language that was being used against people just like these youth, like Coates, like the people he's describing as super predators, and it was, these narratives that said by nature, by default, inherently in their DNA, these young Black kids, particularly young Black men, are violent predators, etc., right? And it's interesting because he uses the same imagery here that would be used to justify kind of the idea. Think about our consumer conversation. They're just flashy. They're into puffy coats and leather coats and et cetera, et cetera. They just want to look good. They don't care about anything but that, right? These negative external narratives are deconstructed when we know the reality of how Black people were targeted by marketing, right? Or, as Coates gets into here, when you know the reality of these are people who have grown up afraid of what the streets will do to them. Whether it's the fear of police violence, whether it's the violence within those communities that's produced by conditions of systematically created poverty and lack of opportunity, whether it's, all the other threats of the streets, people are afraid and they're trying to find a way. If this is the only world they know, right, they're trying to find a way to affirm their sense of self and power. And one of the ways he talks about that being done is you learn a culture of the streets. And this is something we dig into more in the reading. But the way you dress, the way you carry yourself, the way you behave is meant to perform and to exude a sense of assuredness, a sense of power in this world, right? And so Coates really frames the fact that like that desire and that performance of power is an act of resisting what the rest of the world has said about Black people, especially young Black, youth, right? The idea that they have no worth, that they are at the bottom of the hierarchy, that they are so worthless that their lives can be stolen away by police, for example, right? So he reframes the way that they will be perceived as just, young boys hanging out in the corner in their baggy coats and with their chains. And he says, this is their way of affirming a sense of self a sense of assuredness, a sense of power in the face of a world that tells them that they are powerless, right? It doesn't take away the very real threats in other circumstances, but he reframes the reality of these from the perception of the people who are living that way, right? Of saying, from a human perspective, what do you do in the face of being disempowered, right? Some people are going to choose different avenues, but everybody deserves that humanization and understanding of why and how they are, living the lives that they're living. And so he's giving us a very different lens. People who would normally by, dominant white society just be cast aside or thrown away as unworthy. And I want you to remember this when we get into, particularly when we watch Moonlight, because that's something that that film also does very well. It gives us a very, very different view of the people that dominant kind of society would condemn as just, gangsters or things like that. So I think I'm gonna skip, well, I'll briefly tell you about this. Don't worry about it too much. But I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you or explain that Ta-Nehisi Coates and what he's doing in what you've read and in the book Between the World and Me is a really good example of Black existentialism. And this isn't a philosophy class, so I'm not expecting you to know much about existentialism, but I want you to maybe understand what Black existentialism is, so maybe take notes on that piece on the right side, and how this is an example of it. So when you talk about kind of the dominant kind of in philosophy, the way that existentialism is talked about, and again, this is the dominant kind of, predominantly white view of existentialism, historically speaking, was, this idea that, we get our meaning from individual choice and action rather than some outside force, right? So this famous saying, existence precedes essence, right? Really what this was is, it was a departure from kind of the historical way that people saw the world and your fate being determined by deities or, other things like that. And it was a philosophical movement that said, the world and life are just really absurd. And the way we have meaning is by creating it, right? Our existence is what we make of it, not what fate or God or deities do. And I'm giving you such a truncated version of this, but that's the general view, right? Black existentialism is very interesting and really frames this course, quite frankly, because it takes that, but it also is kind of inserting the reality of Black experience, both globally and specifically, in this case, in the US, right? So it's really about theorizing how Black life is radically shaped by kind of these social forces or processes of racialization. So what do I mean by that? We got done studying, we looked at the poetry, we looked at Anne Petrie, we've looked at Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? And these are all, in many ways, they are reflecting a Black existentialist view of the world. Because they are saying, yes, individuals like the people in that kitchen in that poem, right? Or, hit the sun in Between the World and Me he's talking to. They have desires, they have things they want to make of themselves in their lives, but the reality for Black people is that there are these broad social forces, right? And Petrie and Coates use nature imagery to show how powerful they are, that these radically shape Black life in ways that can't be denied, right? So Black existentialism is really about, yes, you do as a person, you want to make your way and your sense of meaning and purpose in this world, but because of the way that Blackness has evolved over time, and because Blackness has evolved as a category that originally came out of very kind of out of white supremacist attempts to categorize and dehumanize people of African descent, and I like that quote from Coates where he says, they made us a race but we made ourselves a people, but the Black people have responded by creating their own sense of self and meaning, that the answer to meaning, to existence, is that communal struggle against those conditions, right? So it's saying it's not fate, right? Just like Coates says, you can't just say, oh, well, that's just the way racism is or how race works. It's not fate. It's not, some predestined force. But these are powerful social and economic forces. And Black existentialism is really about understanding the nature of how that shapes Black life and what it means communally to resist that, to carve out a different sense of being and ways of being in this world. So you can see that a lot in this text. And it relates to the last thing I want to leave you with, right? So we've talked a little bit in this course. You all have been pretty good in your posts of like, well, what do we do? How do you respond to this, right? And when I used to teach Between the World and Me, I would always get people who were like, well, this is really depressing because he just lays out kind of the reality of anti-Blackness and anti-Black violence and what that means for people, Black people in this world. But what's the answer, people often ask, right? And so one thing that you all have kind of talked a little bit in your posts, and that I think Coates really does answer, even though it might not seem like it, is how does one respond to the streets, right? So he spends a lot of time, just like Petrie, just like our poets, and just like we've done for the past, 9 weeks, digging into how the streets were made through policy, and then what they are, right, as this social force that limits Black opportunity in life, that, fosters fear, that, creates these threats of violence against Black people. Like, he really digs into all of those realities, right? And he writes this letter to his son because he wants his son to understand fully what it is to live in a Black body in this world, right? But he doesn't say that the streets are something, insurmountable necessarily. Like Petrie, he rejects the idea that you can just individually overcome it by just working hard, right? And so he digs into that. But he does offer something alternative. Partially, this comes through his discussion of Howard University and what that meant for him. Because remember, he grew up in West Baltimore and he talks about it as a world apart. All he knew were the streets. All he knew was that reality. And all he saw were parents and elders who were afraid. And either you bought into respectability politics and did well in school, which he struggled with a bit because he was, a creative thinker. And often if you are creative or you are independent, schools historically have punished that in Black students. And so he thought, well, if that's not his avenue, most people around him he saw were coming to the streets through drugs, through being imprisoned, through things like that. That was the world he knew. So when he got to Howard University and he met Black people from different classes and different ethnicities and different places and learned about Black history and philosophy, I mean, it changed his entire life, right? And this is where you get this quote where he says, "Now I saw that we had made something down here, in slavery, in Jim Crow, in the ghettos. At the Mecca, which is what he calls Howard University, I saw how we had taken their one-drop rule, right, the way that Black people are racialized, and flipped it. They made us into a race. We made ourselves into a people." So one way that Coates suggests we respond to the streets is by challenging these dominant narratives or by coming up with our own definitions and understandings of ourselves and our relationships to one another, particularly as Black people, right? So the streets may define Blackness as poor, as, financially irresponsible, as violent, but he redefines that through his book, and he suggests that in challenging that, that's another way we resist the streets, right? We have to work together, whether it's, through activism, through your work, right? But challenging those narratives is one way that we should respond to the streets, according to Coates. The other thing, and this is what he really leaves his son with, and remember, this is a letter to his son, and a lot of it is just like, here's the horrible reality of being Black, but he doesn't just leave his son to feel sad and say, like, your life's going to be horrible because you're Black, right? This is important, this quote that I'm going to read of what he really leaves his son with. "We knew we did not lay down the direction of the street, but despite that, we could and must fashion the way of our walk. And that is the deeper meaning of your name, that the struggle in and of itself has meaning." So it's easy to miss in the broad kind of scope of the book and even in what you read. But what he emphasizes to his son, his name means, the struggle, is that when we fight against these conditions, even though they feel totalizing, even though the reality of being black in this world, in this country, can be overwhelming, even though people's lives are being stolen, that when we work together and we identify and we fight and we deconstruct these realities, that has meaning, right? And he tells the son, you might not see the end of this in your lifetime, but your life, your purpose is to challenge and to fight against these conditions, and that has meaning, right? That's how you respond to the streets. You don't just accept it for what it is, but you understand it and you fight against it. And so I think that's one of the maybe more powerful things um, that he kind of makes a case for, of how do we deal with the streets, right? When understanding them and understanding, their impact and their reality and their significance, and not denying that and thinking, well, I can escape it if I just work hard enough. He challenges that, but he does say that together we can do something about it. So I'll leave you with that, and hopefully you enjoyed Coates' reading. There's a lot more to dig into in terms of kind of the different ways he deals with the streets as an idea, and how he really digs into kind of the impact of geographic segregation. But the other reading you have digs into that, and I'll post a video of him actually interview talking to be your other kind of third lecture video for this week. And hopefully this has given you a lot to think about as we turn towards film and television next week.